Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I am your host, Joanna. Let's get started. Hi everyone and welcome back. Today I am going to be talking about eating disorders, something that I'm very excited to talk about because I think we just don't talk about it enough these days. And what are they really? How do we combat the complexities of how it affects our bodies and minds? What is body dysmorphia? We've got so many different questions that we're going to unpack today. And I'm joined by Kathleen Someah. And Kathleen is a licensed clinical psychologist working in the San Francisco Bay Area with a passion for treating different forms of disordered eating and body image dissatisfaction. She also has experience working with younger people, having worked at Stanford Children's Health, supporting children and adolescents with eating disorders related to medical complexities as well. So we are in great hands today. And yeah, Kathleen, hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm great, thank you. It's so great to have you here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
No worries. Now, before we get started, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone with a bit about who you are and what it is you do as well?
Yeah, so like you already said, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I maintain a private practice in the San Francisco Bay Area in a suburb of the Bay Area called Marin County. In my practice, I specialize in eating disorders, treating adolescents. I used to work with kids as well, and some adults and transitional age youth. My focus is, of course, on disordered eating, but within that, I also work a lot with addiction, anxiety, depression, so many different forms of mental illness. And I got my PhD in 2018 from a small school called PGSP, Palo Alto University, which hybrids with Stanford. And I have my own lived experience. So I really draw from that when I'm working with my clients and patients.
Yeah, beautiful. And what led you into a career in this?
So my own lived experience. When I was 13, I was diagnosed with an eating disorder, actually from a doctor at Stanford. And I struggled, for at least 13 years or so. And then sort of when I was going through my own treatment, I realized one of the things that I was really lacking was being able to find other clinicians, other therapists that understood my experience, who could relate to my narrative. And so I decided that I wanted, to go pursue a higher education so that I could support other people that are perhaps suffering and make something out of my personal experience. And so, I went back to school. I actually dropped out of undergrad for a number of years, went back, and then kept going on into a doctoral program where I decided I was going to specialize in this and really try to have an impact in that community. It's something that's very, very dear to my heart.
Yeah, amazing. I think having that personal experience, does that really help you connect with people you work with as well and like as an extra step forward?
It absolutely does. I think that one of the things that's really challenging when you're working with this population is there's a lot of shame around eating disorders. I find that when somebody is struggling with anorexia, they're a little bit more comfortable talking about that. But if they've struggled with bulimia per se, or maybe even binge eating disorder, there tends to be an element of shame. I struggled for so many years that it sort of took me through all different forms of disordered eating. So I really lead with that. That said, I'm also aware that my own experience is mine, right? And I try really hard not to project that onto my clients, of course. But so far in my work, especially with the younger folks, the adolescents, I found that sharing my own story has been really helpful. Because although I have the clinical training and knowledge and expertise from that, I'm also able to talk about some of the nuances in terms of how it presents, what some of the specific challenges are. So I think it's really helped enhance my ability as a clinician.
Yeah, amazing. That's really great to hear as well. I think it's really hard sometimes to talk about a topic when you don't have experience in it as well. Even though like professional experience is great, like having that extra like lived experience is just amazing to be able to connect with as well. So I'm sure a lot of people listening will have something to say about this because they might have gone through it themselves. So it's really great to have this. Now we're just going to jump into some of our get to know the guest questions. So I'm just going to ask you a bit more personal questions just about yourself, not necessarily related to the topic, but what is your favorite book, or do you have one?
I do. I have two favorite books. They're not ones that I've read recently, but I'd say that they are two that have the largest impact on me personally, and also one that has a big impact on me professionally. I think the book Wild by Cheryl Strayed, which has since become a movie starring Reese Witherspoon, great movie, but the book is far superior in my opinion. It's a story of a woman who's going through some real adversity and decides to do this trek across the Pacific Crest Trail, encounters a lot of challenges along the way, but she really perseveres. And so if we're talking about resilience, I think that book actually lends itself really well to that topic. The second book that I really love, and I actually recommend this to my clients every time I get a new client that's struggling with disordered eating or an eating disorder. Those can be a little bit different, actually. I recommend this book, and it's by Jenny Schaefer. And there's two books. There's Life Without Ed, which is the first one. And then there's Goodbye Ed, Hello Me. They're about this woman's journey within her own eating disorder and how she sort of got over it herself with the help of a really awesome psychologist. And it's great. And I sort of view it as like my Bible when I first started working with a client. I reference it all of the time. I think it's inspirational, but it also provides some real tactical approaches in terms of how to fight against this illness. So I'd say those are the two go-tos that really stand out in my mind and my heart.
Beautiful. I would definitely love to give them a go. I'm a massive book nerd as well, so I'm always looking for a new read. Would you say you're more into like nonfiction than you are fiction?
I am. Yeah. I wish I could say that I'm into fiction. I think it's the student in me, going to grad school, you have to sort of have a thirst for knowledge and learning new things. I love sort of anything under the umbrella of nonfiction, specifically things that I can kind of relate to my field and working with my clients. I would love to enjoy fantasy, and that goes for movies as well as books, but I find that I get bored. My husband, I think, always questions me a little bit when I'm constantly asking to watch documentaries instead of fictional movies and things like that.
Yeah, no, I'm the total opposite. I feel like I struggle to get into nonfiction, but I do love a good documentary. Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I just love a bit of fantasy, something that I've never heard about before. But
that's awesome.
Yeah, I know. We should exchange like recommendations.
We should. Yeah, no, I wish I could shut it off and just suspend my imagination, but it's so hard for me to do that.
No, I would honestly love to be just totally into documentaries and just have a massive thirst for knowledge from like nonfiction. But that's amazing. How do you find your books? Do you have them recommended to you, or?
Oh gosh, how did I? So I think the Jenny Schaefer eating disorder books were recommended to me, I want to say, from a support group that I was in. I actually read the first one the night before I went to treatment in the hotel room. I was with my dad before I went to Johns Hopkins treatment facility. And I read it in one go. And I believe that somebody from one of my eating disorder support groups made that recommendation. And I can't remember how I discovered Wild by Cheryl Strayed, but that book sort of became my Bible in a way. I walked around with it. I loved it. It was just so impactful for me, especially through some of the harder times of my early 20s. I think that I kind of stumbled upon it on my own, but I'm not quite sure. I usually just find my books from word of mouth, other colleagues and friends that are in this field. My husband, I joke that he basically eats books for breakfast because he just is reading them constantly. And so he's definitely a good source of, popular books that I probably should sit down and read.
Yeah, great. It sounds like you've got a good network for finding different books.
I do.
Moving into our next question, do you have a movie that you've recently enjoyed or like an old-time favorite?
Yeah. If you had asked me this like 5 years ago, I probably would have said Garden State. That's always been my favorite movie, in part because I'm such a lover of music, and I think the soundtrack is better than most soundtracks I've heard. But more recently, I rewatched The Soloist, and it's it's so powerful. Robert Downey Jr.'s in it. I am forgetting the name of the lead actor. It's going to come to me, of course, later on. But it's about this man who is homeless in LA. He struggles with mental illness, and he is a classical musician. And this reporter, Robert Downey Jr., stumbles upon him to write a news story. It's a story of how this reporter sort of changes the life of this man who's homeless and sort of helps to magnify his musical ability. And it's a really, really heartwarming story. I used to play the viola and violin too. And so I think that's kind of why I was drawn to it initially, because of the classical music aspect to it. But I really recommend it. It's very, very powerful. And it's based on a true story. So there we go. I can't even watch anything that's not at least based on truth.
Another nonfiction. We love that.
Right.
I'll have to add that one to my list as well.
It's so good.
Yeah. Okay, great. I will definitely get onto that one. And I know we talked about this before, but I would love for you to share with us the podcast that you love.
Yeah. So my husband, I've actually never been a huge podcaster. I don't listen to that many of them. And surprise, surprise, when I do, it's usually something related to psychology. But my husband and I and our now 10-month-old daughter went to Europe for a month in April. And so we needed a lot of podcasts because we were doing a lot of long drives. And I discovered Chameleon. And within that, I think Chameleon is like the organization or whatever that makes these podcasts. They did one called Wild Boys. And it's about these two young men who suddenly emerge from like the woods, essentially, into this small Canadian town. I can't remember what the town is called. And this town is just like taken aback by these two boys because one of them looks so gaunt and malnourished, and they're both very quiet, and they just really stick out as kind of odd. And the town rallies around them, and these boys essentially confess, we don't have any family. We were raised in the bush, is how they refer to it. And so this town does like a GoFundMe, finds them housing. They're just like blown away by these two people that just emerge suddenly with no family, claiming they've never seen a computer screen or anything of that sort. And I'm going to give it away, so a little spoiler alert, but it turns out these two boys are from a really lovely home in Sacramento, California, and they just ran away. But it had so many twists and turns, and it was so captivating. So that's one that I really liked. And then I also just recently listened to one about Teal Swan. I'm not sure if you've heard of her, but she's within the psychotherapy self-help world. She has quite a following, and it's sort of it looks at sort of the controversial nature of her practice and her claims to sort of be like a mental health guide to people that have experienced trauma. It's interesting. I think they're both worth a listen for sure. They're very entertaining for sure.
Wow, I love how you're giving me all these new recommendations. I haven't heard of these podcasts before, but I definitely want to give them a go. Yeah, especially the first one, like Wild Boys, right?
Yeah, and I couldn't believe that I'd never heard about this on the news or anything, because it sounds like such a big story. It's fascinating. Yeah. I gave away the ending, but it's still worth listening to.
It's okay. We've got a spoiler alert, so hopefully people will skip past that and they'll listen to this podcast. But that's amazing. I think we're ready to jump right into our interview questions.
Great.
Like, to start off with, why is resilience important in your life?
Yeah, I think resilience is why I've entered this field. I think in order to recover from an eating disorder, you have to be resilient. You have to believe in resiliency, not just for other people, but for yourself. Eating disorders are illnesses that really take a grip on a person. They can really beat you down. There's so many moments where you can get off course. And I feel like the word that describes the recovery journey itself is resiliency. So that's sort of how it's shown up for me. And I don't think that I ever would have described myself as a resilient human being prior to entering recovery. And it's something I talk a lot about with my clients. It's something that's really hard for them to see within themselves, because I've noticed that a lot of clients that struggle, they see themselves as weak, as burdensome, as all of these negative adjectives, when resiliency and resilience is in fact the word that comes to mind first for me. I did an exercise when I was doing a training at a hospital, and I asked people, what are some of the first words that come to mind when I say the word eating disorder? Resilience was not one of those. It was burdensome, weak, deceitful, exhausting, all of these other things. But then when I talked about the strength that is required in order to recover and the ability to, be pushed down and stand up again, it really made sense to people that resiliency is in fact a really core element of a lot of people that have sort of walked this path of struggle and recovery.
Yeah, for sure. And do you find that when you're working with clients that you're not only trying to help them out of their eating disorder, but also building their resilience at the same time as well?
Yeah, I'm helping them. I think I do both. I think in order to walk beyond that of the illness, it's about embodying resilience. It's about recognizing that you have this strength that maybe brought you into the illness itself, but it can also carry you out of it. Eating disorders, especially anorexia in particular, require a lot of discipline. It's somebody who has an idea and they're really focused on achieving it. It just happens to be that thing is also what can potentially kill them. So I think part of the working with my clients is helping them believe in themselves, helping them believe that they can redirect that strength towards something else that's a little bit more emotionally fulfilling and less maladaptive. So yeah, it's certainly something that we talk about and that I think is really, really important when they're walking that path of healing.
That's amazing. And I really want to move into talking about stressors and adversity. And I know you've just touched on that, but do you think resilience means being immune to stresses and adversity? I personally think that there's so much more to that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I don't think it has anything to do with immunity from stress or adversity. I think resilience is being able to acknowledge when something is really affecting you. It's being able to notice these stressors, face them, maybe even get knocked down by them, but then stand back up again, right? I mean, I think that's where we realize our core strength, we realize how powerful and strong we can be. In my own experience, I realized my personal resiliency when I faced those stressors and when I didn't necessarily just overcome them, but when I was able to move through them, even if moving through them was really tough. So I think that those are actually opportunities to recognize it and learn more about what resilience can mean to us individually.
Yeah, for sure. And it must be really hard when someone's going through an eating disorder and people around them just say, oh, just start eating. Oh, just start doing this. It's so much more complex than let me just abandon this mindset and let me just start eating normally or stop binging.
Absolutely. It often has nothing to do with food. Food is sort of a manifestation of the other stuff that's going on. The majority of the clients that come to me have heard somebody say to them at least once, why can't you just eat? They've got, fielded people's frustration, just take that bite. I don't understand why you're so affected by this. And the answer is it might start out having to do with the food, but it actually doesn't end up being all about the food. Most people, in my experience, are using food as a way to manipulate their emotions. They're using food as a celebratory thing. They're using it as a way to cope with stress, depression, anxiety, sadness, loneliness, boredom, you name it, really any sort of emotion. So food is sort of just a byproduct of whatever their internal emotional experience is. I think that for some people that start an eating disorder because they have this really clear desire to lose weight, you could say that, yeah, it's about the food. They're cutting out the food because they want their bodies to be smaller. But it's also more than that. It's wanting to take up less space in the world. It's wanting to feel accepted. And food is the tool that they use in order to accomplish that goal. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. How would you define eating disorders? I feel like society has this like preconceived idea of what an eating disorder is, but I feel like there's some misconceptions surrounding that.
So many misconceptions. I think that a lot of people, and I do believe that this belief is changing more and more, but I think that a lot of people that assume that if you have an eating disorder, you are usually a cisgender white female, usually a little bit affluent. That has been proven over and over to not be the case. In fact, I think that belief has sort of masked other ethnicities, other sexual and gender identities that are also struggling. And so it leads to underreporting because those other communities don't come forward and say, hey, I'm also struggling.
Yeah.
A lot of people also have this image in their mind when you talk about eating disorders as somebody who is very gaunt, very malnourished. You know, they have that sunken facial features. They look tired. They're small. They have a very delicate frame. Most of my clients don't look that way. The majority of my clients, now I've had some that fill that stereotype, but most of them are passing as somebody on the street who's extremely healthy looking. They might be smiling. They might look really alive and like they're physically thriving, but internally they're really struggling. I know that for me, when I was at my worst, at my sickest point, I looked totally fine. And so no one knew about it. I could pass it off as like, oh, I'm just not hungry or whatnot, come up with all kinds of excuses. But the alarms weren't flaring because I didn't look super thin. So, eating disorders can affect any size, any shape, any weight. It doesn't have anything to do necessarily with the number. Now, within diagnostic criteria, there is, for at least anorexia, a focus on wanting to lose weight. There used to be a focus on the person having to have lost their menstrual cycle. It was pretty deeply ingrained in the medical and psychological community that had to be a criteria in order for someone to be diagnosed. The problem with that is men don't have a menstrual cycle, so it completely excluded them from it. So I think we're seeing lots of changes and shifts in terms of what we think of when we imagine somebody with this presentation. But I also find that, some people really get stuck in those old school stereotypes surrounding disordered eating.
Yeah, for sure. And what are like the different types of disordered eating? Are there some that we don't really hear too much about? I know we've got like anorexia, bulimia, and like binge eating. Are there any others that we haven't covered?
Yeah, so I'll just do sort of a broad stroke summary. So anorexia is typically a focus on losing weight, an intense fear of weight gain, and so food refusal because of a fear of gaining weight and a desire to lose weight. Those people are often underweight. But under what weight is the question I always ask. What is underweight for one person might not be for somebody else. So just to throw out some random numbers, let's say, actually, I'm going to stay away from numbers because it can be triggering. But each person's healthy baseline in terms of weight varies depending on genetics, depending on bone size, muscle mass, all of those factors. So it's hard to say that they have to be within a certain weight range in order to meet that criteria. Bulimia is when you are purging your food. One of the things people don't recognize is purging isn't just vomiting or throwing up. Purging is also laxative use and abuse and excessive compulsive exercise. It's sort of any behavior where you're trying to get rid of calories consumed, again, with an interest and an effort to lose weight. Within anorexia, for example, there's a subcategory of binge purge. So it gets a little bit nuanced where you're restricting most of the day and then you'll binge, but you'll throw it up. People that struggle with anorexia can be smaller in stature, whereas people that struggle with bulimia might look a little bit more on the healthier side, but be just as sick, of course. And that is just because calories consumed can vary. Binge eating is when you're eating an excessive amount of calories from your body, but most notably, you experience this sense of loss of control. It's not just a subjective loss of control around food, but an objective loss of control. One that people don't talk about as much is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. It's called ARFID. Quite a mouthful of a name, no pun intended, but it's typically more prevalent amongst younger populations. So when I've worked with cases in which someone's struggling with ARFID, I've had a client that was as young as 4 years old that was struggling, and it's sort of it's a neophobia, an extreme form of picky eating that leads to medical complexities. So it can lead to children being diagnosed as failure to thrive. There's no body image component per se, but it's an intense fear of certain foods. Unfortunately, a lot of those kids get mistaken for being on the autism spectrum when in fact it's actually ARFID. So in some of my own clinical experience, I've sort of had to help other clinicians and pediatricians disentangle like the difference between the two and say, no, this kiddo actually doesn't have ASD. I really believe that they just have ARFID. And then the treatment looks very different. A disorder that we don't talk as much about in the literature, but I think it's maybe getting a little bit more traction in terms of like, the media and whatnot, is something called orthorexia. It's not in the DSM-5. I don't believe it is anyway. I should know those things. But I believe that there's talk about it for sure being in subsequent editions of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is very, very common. It's essentially this focus on healthy eating. So you've probably seen commercials on Instagram, Facebook, TV, wherever people see commercials now, or ads where it'll say like this has clean ingredients. The idea of eating very clean might be like free of gluten, free of dairy, free of saturated fats, which is very different from a person that's getting rid of those things because they have like a specific medical diagnosis that prevents them from eating those things. Orthorexia is this preoccupation with, I want to eat all clean foods. I want to eat all organic. There is a focus on health as well as weight loss, but it's sort of masked under the umbrella as just like healthy eating, if that makes sense. And it's so common. I'll actually get a lot of clients that will come to me about something completely unrelated to an eating disorder. And then we start to peel back sort of the layers and we see that there's actually some orthorexia at play. So it's extremely common and hopefully getting a little bit more recognition than it used to be so we can be treating it.
Yeah, for sure. And do you think it's important to have more information out there so people might have more awareness if they are suffering with one of these disorders so they can get help more easily?
Yeah, I do. And I think it's really important to start that messaging early on in people's like academic institutions. A lot of times kids go to the pediatrician and they're told, don't drink so much soda, don't eat so much sugar. This is what your BMI is. But what they're not talking about is like, what is your relationship with your body? What is your relationship like with food? They're saying all these do nots. And I think children interpret that as, oh, those things are bad, therefore I'm bad. And so I think that we should be having more conversation around our relationship with our bodies, our relationships with different foods, and also spreading awareness to parents about how these eating disorders can show up. Because I think a lot of parents assume it's like a really, really malnourished kid. So I think that starting much younger is important in order to sort of prevent this from taking over as people become young adults.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've got like sex ed in school and kids start to learn about that so young, but that's also the age where these sorts of things start coming up as well. And they've really got not much guidance to help them through that, or not much like education surrounding what they're going through, and they have to figure that out. And then it leads to years of struggling before they even realize that they're suffering with something.
Absolutely. And I think that it's a fine line because you want to provide the education, but as you probably know, like kids are also really impressionable, right? So you don't want to influence them too much. So it's really hard to navigate. But I do think it's something, like you said, important, just like with sex ed. It's one of the number one killers for adolescents under 18. So why aren't we talking about it more, especially at a young age?
Yeah, for sure. And I really just want to debunk this idea that people think that eating disorders are the individual's fault or there is a blame place. Like, is this true?
No, it's not true.
Yeah.
We have to take some responsibility for our actions. I made a very conscious decision. I was bullied severely. I really wanted to fit in. And I made this conscious decision of, okay, I'm going to try to change my physical appearance because I think that it's going to help me achieve the social goals that I want. I was only 13. I had no idea what the implications were. It's important to take responsibility for that. But I'm not at fault, because what happens is your brain sort of develops around this new addiction. We're also inundated with so many messages in the media about how we're supposed to look, even messages around health. And like I said, clean eating. So I really believe that people in this world the cards are kind of stacked against them. They're inundated with so many maladaptive viewpoints on what a healthy body image is, and what healthy food is. Something that I really struggle with is when parents come to me and they say, what have I been doing wrong? Is it the way I talked about my body? Is it the kinds of foods that I've had in the house? Is that what's causing my child's illness? And the answer is no. That can have an influence, but parents are just as vulnerable to those influences from the media. So I think we have to think more, at the higher up on the chain in terms of where the fault lies, rather than within the individual that's struggling.
Yeah, definitely. And is there anything else we might get wrong when it comes to eating disorders?
I think the biggest one is that weight is a indicator of level of severity. That's a huge one. I think that's the one that I confront the most. It goes as far as with insurance companies, saying, well, that person doesn't meet medical criteria for us to cover their care. That's a huge misconception within this disorder. I'd say that's probably the biggest for me. Another one, though, I've noticed is this misconception that, men don't struggle nearly as much as women do. It's not true at all. We're starting to see more and more that within the gay community, there's a huge preoccupation with body image. There's lots of eating disorders, but also within the straight male community. Unfortunately, because we don't automatically think that it affects straight men as well, those men often go undiagnosed because there's a lot of shame that interferes with them coming forward and saying, hey, I need a little bit of help.
Yeah, for sure. I can't imagine how hard it must be, especially for men to come forward with this, because there's also this idea of toxic masculinity and maintaining an image that really prevents people from coming forward because they think there's so much to be ashamed of in admitting that they're struggling.
Totally. And, men are encouraged to work out and build muscle, but that can also be a form of disordered eating. It can meet criteria for purging, right? I mean, that excessive exercise piece. When I was going to the gym way back in the day, I don't go anymore because I don't have time. I remember seeing so many people and the same people over and over, and you could tell that men had just been working themselves out to death. And you could just tell that it was driven by something more than a desire to release endorphins in their brain and feel good. It was very disordered in nature.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this leads really well into my next question of how do societal or cultural messages about beauty and body image contribute to eating disorders? I know social media plays a massive part in influencing this nowadays.
Absolutely. So I recently had a baby. She's 10 months old. And it's interesting how social media feeds you the kinds of ads that are relatable to whatever phase of life you're in. And so on my Instagram feed, and I have no idea where this started, or ads in all different kinds of places, I would see these ads for bouncing back after having a baby. And so even when you've done something as much of a miracle and as beautiful as housing a human and giving birth to life, you're told you need to change. It's everywhere. For young kids, even there's commercials for low sugar things, and nothing wrong if your dentist says eat less sugar because you're going to get cavities, but that's not necessarily something everyone has to do. And kids don't know how to make sense of these messages. And so they just hear them and they think, okay, I need to make these changes. Otherwise I'm bad. I think social media especially really needs to change, and advertisements that people see on TV, they play a huge role in the development of disordered eating and body image disturbance.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when you see like your favorite celebrity promoting weight loss tea or gummies or all these new and different things. You must think, oh, wow, like they're doing it. This must be great. But in reality, they're getting paid to do that.
Exactly. And I feel badly mentioning celebrities that I also really like. Like, I love Jessica Simpson. I was a huge Jessica Simpson fan growing up. But even, she's been under the microscope for this because she's been coming out having lost, I think, 100 pounds or some enormous number. And young kids that can't look at that because they don't have the knowledge and awareness to say, like, that's not good. They're seeing that and they're thinking, oh, so maybe I should do the same. Yeah. It's everywhere, the before and the after photos. I think also what people don't recognize is there's a lot of Photoshop and editing that goes into stuff. Many of my adolescent clients, I've actually asked them virtually, show me your Instagram feed, not like their friend feed, but just the random feed of things that they get. And a lot of it is like different weight loss tips showing, I lost X many pounds in 40 days. Here's my before and my after. And so these teenagers start to believe that that's attainable, when really it was editing, tons and tons and tons of photo editing and apps that allow a person to shrink their body to a different size. But when you don't have that awareness, you think, oh, it's because they started exercising a lot and eating differently, so therefore I'm going to do the same. But what happens is those teenagers end up developing an eating disorder.
Yeah, for sure. And do you think, I know it's a bit left field, but do you think like cosmetic surgery comes into play in any way with people with eating disorders? Do they think this is some sort of like temporary fix or a solution to achieving that ideal body?
I think that some do. I think it really varies depending on the person. I've had a couple clients who are young adults, freshmen, sophomore in college. And so they're legally allowed to pursue cosmetic surgery without their parents' consent. And for those people that I'm thinking of, there was this deep belief that if they changed the way their body looked via surgical procedures, they would feel better about themselves. But I like to remind people that doing that is sort of like a game of whack-a-mole. I don't know if you're familiar with that kids game, but basically you have like a hammer and you knock the mole down and then another one pops up. I was a nanny before I got my doctorate, so I have a lot of kid game analogies in my tool belt. But it's sort of like that, right? You fix this one part of your body, but then you end up focusing on something else, and then you fix that, and then that, and then that, and that's sort of where body dysmorphia can emerge. You start looking to all these different surgeries to get the body you want, and before you know it, you've kind of developed an addiction per se to plastic surgery.
Yeah, definitely. And is body dysmorphia something that comes after you've sort of developed the eating disorder, or is it something you can start with, or do you normally talk about it that way?
So it's definitely something you can start with. It's not something that I have a ton of experience treating because it's different from classic disordered eating. Body dysmorphia can come in the form of me, let's say, looking at my face and thinking that I have an enormous nose. I have a normal nose. It works. It's not too big, not too small. It's normal. But somebody with body dysmorphia might look in the mirror and see this enormous thing on their face. That has nothing to do with weight loss or manipulating their food intake. So it doesn't necessarily have to do with an eating disorder thing per se, but it is a preoccupation with appearance of some sort, some part of your body, and then this intense desire to want to change that. And also a lot of anxiety around that part of your body and fear of judgment and whatnot.
Yeah, for sure. And what would you say are like those first steps for people to separate their sense of self from their eating disorder?
Yeah, so one of the things I'll often ask my clients is to imagine a time in their life when they were happy. That can be a really difficult exercise for some of my clients because some people struggle to think of any time in their life when they felt happy. But I think that exercise can really help you overcome this illness. I think that remembering that type of person that you were, the things that you were interested, can help you develop an identity that's separate from the illness. One of the things that I notice with my clients is they say, like, I'm anorexic. I'm bulimic versus I have an eating disorder. If somebody is diagnosed with cancer, they don't say like, hi, I'm Kathleen, I'm cancer. They say, hi, I'm Kathleen, and I have this disease and I'm fighting it. And yet with mental illness, we assume the label and we start to embody it. And so helping people move past that identity means helping them remember, the things that used to make up their identity. Hobbies. Are they a good friend? Were they a student? What made them happy? What made them smile? What made them sad? And helping them focus on those things and get back to that so that they're not so beholden to this negative voice that's cutting them down all the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. Why do you think people start to lose a sense of their identity when they start developing an eating disorder?
Because it becomes your world. When I was in the thick of my illness, I would, joke that I was in a relationship with this other being that was in my brain, which I realize sounds a little bit wacky, but it's all consuming. The longer a person struggles, the more likely they are to not be able to function in school. They'll lose friendships. Gosh, heaven forbid, be able to find a romantic relationship because people get tired of dealing with it. And so as people's worlds get smaller, the eating disorder voice gets louder and louder. And I think people begin to identify with it even more. A lot of times, I'll speak for myself, mine developed when I was 13. So I was at the height of coming into myself. Instead of coming into myself as this young, vibrant pre-adolescent, I came into myself as somebody that was struggling with anorexia and bulimia. And so that's all I knew. And it was around during these formative years when I was learning to cope with adversity, but instead of coping with it in a healthy, reasonable manner, I was coping with things using food. So I stopped. That's all I knew. And I think that's the case with a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. And what is the role of personal resilience when it comes to mental health issues dealing with eating disorders?
Yeah. What is the role of personal resilience? I think it is a strength of fire within people. It's a desire. Actually, I take that back. It's not so much a desire, but a willingness to believe that there's something else out there and a willingness to take a step forward, even when you take 2 steps back. The people that recover from an eating disorder, whether they fully recover or they just sort of change some of their beliefs around food, they are such resilient people. They have to be, because in order to recover, you take a really sinuous path. You go down, different offshoots of the primary recovery path, and you have to motivate yourself to get back on. And that means being resilient. It means being willing to fight back when you feel like you're punched down by the illness, being able to talk back to it, being able to refute the things that it's telling you that aren't true about yourself. So I think resiliency is really at the heart of the recovery journey, and something that's really important to focus on in therapy with a person's treatment team. It's something that I certainly emphasize a lot.
Yeah, for sure. And there are definitely things like we've talked about that the individual can do for themselves, like seeking help. But what can us as a society do to help people and help minimize this harm related to eating disorders?
Yeah, really good question. A couple things. I think checking in with those around you, when you notice that something's off with a friend, asking them, what's going on with you? I've noticed that you seem a little bit different. You don't necessarily have to come out and say, why aren't you eating your food? You can ask about it in a roundabout way, because I think that allows people to be more transparent and less on the defense. Another thing that I think is really important is to really popularize this health at every size model. It's definitely gaining more traction in the media and certainly within my immediate community, but it's this belief that health can happen across all body shapes and weights. There's a belief that having fat and identifying as fat is a bad thing. Fat is a substance on our body that we need. People can have more fat on their body and it doesn't make them any less healthy. They can be thriving from a medical standpoint, but there's this really deeply ingrained assumption that if you're over a certain weight, you're not living your best life. I think the other thing that we can do to fight against the surge of eating disorders that I'm certainly seeing is, question your media consumption a little bit. Be a conscious consumer of what you're hearing and what you're seeing. That includes what you hear and what you see from your medical provider. When a kid goes to their doctors often use the basic mass index, the BMI, as a benchmark for health. I won't swear, but we used to refer to the BMI as the bull S mass index, because it's not the word of God per se. It has some flaws to it. And I think a lot of people don't know that unless you're really educated in this stuff. And so being even a conscious consumer in those things, and when you go to your medical provider, I think is, could be a helpful step in helping to prevent this a bit.
Yeah, for sure. And I really wish we had so much time to just talk about it, because the more you talk, the more questions I have for you. But can eating disorders have a long-term impact on self-esteem and self-worth, even when you've, surpassed the disorder and you're feeling more healthy?
I think it can. And I think that my answer might be a little bit surprising. I find that when someone really embraces recovery fully, they really do the work, that they actually have a much healthier body image than the average person that's never struggled. They can feel more self-confident because they've had to work on this stuff a lot more. If you've never had an eating disorder, you probably haven't had conversations with yourself about your value and your self-worth, and you haven't had to challenge all of these other statements happening around you. Somebody going through the recovery journey is doing that, and they're doing it over and over and over and over. I know for myself, when I entered this deeper level of recovery, I felt so much more confident in my body, not because it looked how I wanted it to be, but because I had fully accepted the fact that my body changes and my body is more than its physical appearance. So although for some people having an eating disorder, even post-recovery, can impact them negatively, I find that a lot of my clients sort of become champions for body acceptance. And they actually live more full and secure and confident lives than had they not struggled at all to begin with. A lot of times people become spokespeople for the recovery community, or they're like me and they enter this field where they want to help others that are struggling. And in order to do that, you have to sort of recite these positive messages over and over and over. And so you believe them more and more and more. So I certainly think it can actually help people in the end if they get through recovery.
Yeah, that's amazing. And that in itself is resilience at play, which is awesome. But what about those people who are struggling to build that positive self-image? How do you go about helping them be more confident in themselves?
That's really hard. You can't force someone to be confident in themselves. You can meet them where they're at in their journey. I will recognize that, you don't love the way you look today, but what is your body doing for you? And so I'll often encourage my clients to focus on the function of their body, not the form of their body. It feels really cheesy to them, but I know through my own practice that it can be really impactful. So thinking about the things you value in your body, right? Maybe it's just that your legs got you from one thing to another, but that's still something to have gratitude for. It's not, feeling confident in your body isn't something that happens overnight. It's something that takes years and years and years to embody. It takes somebody a long time to feel really terrible about themselves. So it takes even longer to start to feel good. I remind people that just because you feel this way right now doesn't mean you're going to feel this way tomorrow. For some people, embracing themselves and loving themselves isn't even the goal. The goal is acceptance regardless of and respect regardless of whether they like their body or not. You can wake up each day and have a really full life and not love the way you look in the mirror. But that doesn't mean that you're necessarily manipulating your caloric intake, right? It just means you're, okay, I don't really like my body that much, and yet it's allowing me to do all of these other really cool things, and those are things I value. So sometimes body image, love isn't even the goal. It just really depends client to client.
Yeah, for sure. And we've established that there is a clear impact on our relationship with ourselves. How do you think eating disorders affect our other relationships, romantic, family, friendships?
Oh my gosh, they have such an impact. It's when I've worked with teens, for example, it's a family disorder. There's something called family-based therapy. And the reason that thing exists is because it's a family affair. It brings everyone down because, if you just think about it, across all cultures, food is a really important activity per se. You come around the dinner table or you sit on the sofa around the coffee table and you eat. Whatever your context looks like, food brings people together. And so when you're not comfortable eating with people, or you prefer to eat in secrecy, whatever the manifestation is, like that creates ruptures in relationships. It's also really hard to be in a romantic relationship with somebody, especially if you're intimate sexually, because you're sharing your bodies with one another. And so if you're uncomfortable on your own, it's really scary to share that with somebody else. I remember a lot of my relationships suffering because I wasn't ready to do the work and be really honest with myself. And people get really tired of dealing with it. It's not dissimilar from dealing with a person who is suffering from an addiction with substances like drugs or alcohol. When somebody has an eating disorder for such a long period of time, it kind of changes their personality. They get kind of focused on this fix, right? They get focused on not eating or eating a lot, and that erodes away at the relationship.
Yeah, definitely. It's so hard to sort of work on yourself and also be aware of how it's impacting others, because you're so like caught up in your little world. Like you said, like it consumes your world. So it's just so many different factors at play. And I'd love to now move into like the practices and talk a bit more about you. Like, how do you help maintain your sense of self and self-image?
I think just being in this field helps me redefine what's important to me in terms of self-image. Having a child certainly gave me a new appreciation for my body. I don't see it as something that I'm, only appreciate when it looks good. I experience it as something that's done a really incredible thing and giving life to another human being. Other things that I use to maintain a healthy relationship with myself is, and again, this sounds cheesy, but finding moments to express gratitude to the parts of my body that I previously really hated and talked really cruelly towards. For me, that was my stomach and my thighs. So like I said before, finding the function in those parts of my body and sending a lot of gratitude that way. Another thing I do yes, I'm fully recovered, but every once in a while, those, things pop up in my brain around certain types of food. And in order to get out of my head and back into my body and focusing on what matters, I do this exercise that I also recommend to my clients, which is called 5 New Things. It essentially means I'm looking to my environment to find 5 new things, whether it's, and then within those things, I try to access them according to the 5 senses. Taste is sometimes one that I don't access, but, finding like a piece of grass, like, does it smell? How does it feel? And sort of getting myself out of my head into my physical surroundings can be really, really helpful and grounding. I also like to come home to my breath. So feeling the sensation of air through my body takes the focus away from the form of my body as well. So those are some of my practices and also ones that I encourage my clients to utilize when needed.
Yeah, amazing. And do you find that there are any challenges to these practices you use?
Yeah, it can be really hard for people to sit in their body and sort of hold a magnifying glass up to it. I think for some clients, especially those that have a trauma history, closing your eyes and focusing on the feeling of breath can be really activating. It can start to feel unsafe. For clients that have that experience, I'll often explore doing the 5 New Things exercise, keeping their eyes open, looking at certain things rather than closing their eyes and going inward. So it really depends.
Yeah, for sure. And do you set up like a time in your day where you do these practices, or is it more like ingrained into just your daily life?
Oh my gosh, I wish I could set up a time, but with a 10-month-old, it's literally impossible.
Yeah.
Back in the day, I worked at a treatment facility and I was I was really disciplined about doing meditation in the morning and closing my eyes and checking in with myself. I would actually go paddle boarding and do some meditation on my paddle board in the San Francisco Bay. I do none of that anymore because I don't have time. I wish I could implement it consistently, but I do a lot of active stuff, right? So let's say I'm washing dishes in the kitchen. I might come home to my breath during that time with my eyes open, but noticing the flow of air, or noticing how the water feels in my hand, on my hands, and making it sort of an active mindfulness practice. But so it is a little bit just sort of impromptu versus planned. I do think there's a lot of benefit, though, to scheduling that into your day, especially in the morning, because I think it can kind of set the tone for the rest of the day for people.
Yeah, beautiful. And do you recommend this practice to anyone, or do you encourage people to find what works for them?
Find what works for you, right? This is what works for me. It's what works for some of my clients. A lot of people enjoy progressive muscle relaxation. I walked a client through that and she told me it made things worse. So it really just depends. That was the first time I'd ever heard that. So it really is sort of trial and error and figuring out what works for the individual.
Yeah, for sure. And based on your experience, do you have any other recommendations of practices people can use?
Yeah, I think exercise can be helpful because it helps you focus on the function of your body versus the form. It can also be a slippery slope if somebody has struggled with compulsive and excessive exercise. It can sort of, trigger that part of the brain that uses exercise as a means of compensation for food, calories eaten. But I think exercise can also be a really healthy tool. Journaling is certainly another one, helping people sort of work out their thoughts. Talking to people that feel like really safe resources, I think can also be really useful.
Yeah, amazing. I think this leads on into our next section beautifully, and it will just add to what we've been talking about. But I've got a couple questions from the audience I'd love to ask you.
Okay.
Are there any specific therapeutic approaches or techniques that individuals can use, or that you use with your clients to help build a stronger sense of self?
So I love doing inner child work. And I sort of alluded to it before, but I'll ask people to actually bring onto the computer screen, because I do all virtual sessions, a photo of themselves from when they were free of any preoccupation with food or body image. And talk about who that person was. What are the things that person or that child valued? And then what got in the way? And I think sort of anchoring back to that inner child can be a really helpful way to regain a sense of self. The other thing that I love to do is what's called externalizing the eating disorder. So viewing the eating disorder as this third party that's hijacked a person's brain, almost as if they're like an abusive partner. They say the eating disorder, and we'll often call it by name, usually Ed. The eating disorder says, don't eat that. You're going to gain weight. You're bad if you eat that. And then coming up with personalized, challenging statements to say back to Ed, whether you say it back out loud when you're alone, or you say it sort of silently to yourself, because that helps you separate from the illness and thereby regain a sense of self. It's, learning to rebel against this disorder that's constantly cutting you down and reducing your self-worth towards your weight.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really great technique. I love this idea of the inner child, and sort of speaking to yourself as well is really great. To my next question, does someone ever truly escape the mindset and tendencies from having an eating disorder? I know you mentioned before sometimes things will pop into your mind, but is that always the case?
You can absolutely recover fully from an eating disorder. In fact, that should have been one of the things I mentioned when we were talking about sort of different myths that are worth debunking around disordered eating. You can live a life of total food freedom and free of any preoccupation with your body image. I don't think about my body or food most days. When I do, it's just such a fleeting thought, but it's usually most often it's like, oh my gosh, this would have been a situation that I would have gotten really caught up in, more so than, oh my gosh, I need to change what I'm eating and the way I look. I know so many people that are fully recovered. I have family members where you can ask them about their experience, and it's been so long and they're so on the other side of it that they can't even remember. So eating disorder recovery is 100% possible. And the belief that once you're sick, you're always going to be sick, I think actually keeps people from moving to that next level in their recovery journey, unfortunately.
Yeah, for sure. And one of my personal questions, do you ever find that some people are in this state of like wanting people to pity them and like staying in that sort of mental state, and they like that sort of attention?
I think that for some people that's the case. I think for others it's the exact opposite. For example, in my clinical work, I've worked with people that had sexual trauma histories. They were survivors of sexual assault per se. And for some of those individuals, they wanted to lose weight or actually gain weight because they wanted to be unattractive in their eyes, or they wanted to take up less space. So they were actually trying to achieve the exact opposite, which is leave me alone. It doesn't feel safe if people pay attention to me. I've also worked with individuals that feel like they're not getting enough attention and value from friends and family. That was my experience. And so they want to change the way they look and lose weight so that people start to take them seriously and see like, hey, I'm really suffering. Unfortunately, I think it's too frequent that people say, oh my gosh, you're just doing that for attention. And so therefore, I'm not going to be compassionate and take this seriously. And that can actually exacerbate the illness, because then that person works harder to get those to worry about them, and they just start to kind of spiral.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you so much for having such an open conversation about this topic. I know it can be hard and triggering sometimes, but it's also so hard to traverse. Like the more we've talked about it, the more I've realized how like complex this topic actually is, that it's not just, oh, I've got an eating disorder, or I'm anorexic. Like that's it. There's so much to it.
Mm-hmm. There really is. People just assume that it looks like one thing, but in my work, it's so much more nuanced. And so I think it's important that we're talking about this, and hopefully there can be more everyday communication about how this illness can show up for people.
Yeah, definitely. I hope so too. Let's now get into our open mic section. So here we're just going to invite you to talk about anything you're passionate about. Could be about eating disorders, could be about genuinely anything at all. So Kathleen, the floor is yours.
Gosh, what am I passionate about? I would have said before that I'm passionate about eating disorders in particular. I think that now I'm passionate about mothers, right? And just sort of how our view of self shifts as we become mothers. The reason I'm passionate about that, of course, is because I am a new mom. And it's this world that I never thought that I would enter into, and that I'm just totally blown away by every day. I guess you could sort of relate it to eating disorders, because specifically I'm really interested in sort of how our view of self changes. There's so much selflessness that goes along with becoming a parent. And yet we also don't want to lose sight of who we are. So that's something that's sort of been top of mind. Gosh, what else am I passionate about? I'm incredibly passionate about food, traveling for food. We just did, which is ironic given my area specialty. I think I said this earlier, but my husband and I just did a 1 month long Europe trip where we went to France, Italy, and Croatia. And he jokes that he likes to travel for experiences and sights and hiking, and I travel to eat. Because I love tasting different foods and just experiencing how people enjoy different foods and come together across different cultures. So those are two things that are sort of top of mind and interesting to me at this moment. But it's always evolving based on what's, right in front of me.
Yeah, amazing. No, I can definitely relate to food being my like number one passion in this world. Do you have a favorite cuisine at all?
Okay, that's a hard question. I think Persian food is my favorite. So my father's from Iran, and my parents divorced when I was very young, but my mom learned how to cook amazing Persian food. And so I had it in both households. It's probably still my favorite food. I think, sushi is also a pretty big one for me. Ironically, I didn't crave it once when I was pregnant, which is great because you're not supposed to have raw fish anyway, but that's definitely a trip I want to take I've been to Japan once essentially to eat, but I'd like to go back to go to the Tokyo fish market and all of that. Those are my two favorites, sushi and or Japanese food and Persian food.
Wow, that's amazing. Did you have anything interesting that you tried while you were in Europe?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything I tried though that I haven't had before. Oh gosh, that's a tough question. Interesting things I've tried. I ate a lot of wild boar, which is not something. Have you ever had wild boar?
No, I'm vegetarian at the moment.
I'm so sorry. That's probably offending.
That was like totally horrible to hear, but no, go on.
It's really good. It's really good. But so that was interesting and something that I don't normally have. I'm trying to think of something else that I've tried that's interesting. So not on this trip and actually not out of the States whatsoever. I was visiting my uncle many years ago and he lives in Reston, Virginia. He's Iranian. And in Iran, they usually when you arrive as a show of honor, they sacrifice an animal, a lamb, and then you eat the whole thing. And they didn't do that. It's heartbreaking. I would never handle that well. They didn't sacrifice a lamb or anything, but they prepared the whole thing. And so in cultural tradition, you eat every part of it. And I'd say that was probably the most interesting experience. Also not extremely appetizing, but that's probably my most interesting food experience thus far.
No, that's awesome. I love hearing how like different cultures bring in food and tradition. I think it's so interesting.
It really is. And, some traditions aren't for everybody. But I try to take part in whatever the culture's presenting to me at that time, just more as a show of respect and to give it a shot before I decide if I don't like it.
Yeah, amazing. I love that. So thank you so much for joining us today. I love how we left it on that note. That's so great. Definitely different to what we've been talking about. But I think this conversation has added so much into the much needed variety surrounding this topic. And it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Personally, I know that I've taken so much away from this. Like, we need to make sure that people realize that they're worthy and deserving of help, health, and happiness. Like, no matter who you are, no matter what disorder you have, like having that care and being there for someone is just so important. And just lastly, for those who want to find out more about you or find out any more social media details, where can they go?
They can just Google Kathleen Someah, PhD. My website, KathleenSomeahPhD.com, is a way that they can reach out to me. I'm also on LinkedIn. People are welcome to send me a message. I will always respond. I think it's really important to be there for other people that are interested in learning about this topic professionally and also personally. So those are probably the two best ways to find me. I'm also happy to share an email if that's easier.
We'll also have your details in the description below for anyone who missed that. But to everyone listening, please don't forget to like and subscribe on whatever platform you're using, and we'll see you guys next time. You've been listening to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website, pr.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Joanna. Thanks for tuning in.